I can quote Rabbi Kushner. He says, suffering people don't want explanation. What they want is consolation. They want you to suffer with them, support them, to console them. Yes, okay, I agree. My thesis is, though, how are you coping? How are you possibly coping without an explanation?
Welcome to this Thinking About God podcast, the third in Dr. Barry Whitney's God and Evil series. This episode was recorded in Dr. Whitney's 2006 university course on God and Evil. The podcast has been edited from its original class presentation to make it more suitable for a wider audience. The podcast has been enhanced with original music composed by Dr. Whitney specifically for this podcast series. Among the topics discussed are the problems of moral and physical evils, including natural disasters and animal suffering, gratuitous evils, and the argument that our explanations for suffering usually are far too simplistic. The episode ends with a discussion of the difference between coping and seeking meaningful explanations, those which best help us to reconcile belief in God with evil and suffering. Additional information can be found on the website drbarrywhitney.com.
This gives you a sense of just what it's like to live in the United States of America, which is like Canada, it's across the river, for 1 year. 27,000 people commit suicide in a year, another 5,000 attempt suicide, 26,000 die from fatal accidents in the house, 23,000 are murdered, 85,000 are wounded by firearms, 13 million people are victims of crime. It goes on and on. It talks about illegal drugs, how 125,000 people die of. These are all evils that human beings freely cause. We do it. Moral evil is called sin in Christianity. Its definition is what we freely choose to do. Consciously, and sometimes it's unconscious. Sometimes you can hurt people by acting or deciding or doing things without even being conscious of it, but it's moral evil. It's either omission or commission. You either do it or you admit to do something. And it leads to suicides, murders, crimes, illegal drugs, psychiatric treatment. It says here that almost 7 million people a year go to non-medical services like ministers and welfare people for help. 25 million others seek help from psychiatrists and psychotherapists and medical sources. 80 million people in their lifetime in the States, of 300 million, give or take, 80 million people have sought some kind of psychological help. That's not a moral evil. It's basically moral suffering. My definition of moral evil is going to be expanded into social evils, because we don't talk about those enough. If you have a couple of people or a company committing all of these moral evils, all of a sudden we have a social problem. Drug companies, you know the story, and bad governments. All of a sudden we have a problem of social evils freely caused by human beings. We should also talk about moral evils as mental and psychological and spiritual anguish, loneliness, anxiety, despair, all kinds of unsettledness, unhappiness, a deep-seated unhappiness, a deep unsettling. It's not just you, believe me, it's all of us. A better word would be moral suffering. Moral evil is sin, but moral suffering, it could be mental anguish, loneliness, despair, the pessimism, the fatalism, all of the stuff that a human being goes through in a day or in a lifetime. And it's also psychological, but it's spiritual too. Feelings of being abandoned or wondering whether there's a loving God. It's part of human suffering. Moral evil, mental anguish, psychological, personal anguish, social evil. Maybe it's better to just separate them all. Moral evil, which is individual sinfulness, individual bad choices, individual people using their free will badly, abusing that power we have. So moral evil is clear. We always talk about that, but in the problem of evil, you're not going to see many people talking about social evils, but we should. If you get enough people committing moral evils, or if you get one person with immense power committing a moral evil, now we have a social problem, social suffering, and there's also the mental anguish. If there's one thing that's worse than physical pain, it's mental anguish. It's worse. It's bad to have a broken leg, but it's an awful lot worse to feel abandoned, lonely, despairing, the mental, psychological, and the spiritual anguish that we go through. This is what human life is like. You're going to see when we solve the problem of evil, when we try to answer it, how can you defend God? It's usually these two parts that we can extend into mental anguish and spiritual anguish and social anguish for that first one. But there's always two answers. How do you explain physical evil? How do you explain moral evil? The 100 most deadly natural disasters of the 20th century. My father, who's 93 now, way back in 1917, 4 or 5 years old, he went to sleep one night. They had big families in those days. Beside him is a sister, and the other side's a brother. He woke up in the morning and they were gone. They had died during the night, and apparently, we don't know the figures, but it's at least 20 million people died in 1917 of what's called the Spanish flu. That's the worst natural disaster, and don't think that people weren't asking, where is God? In the top 100, there were 12 major floods that killed millions of people, 24 droughts, that's the top of the list, and earthquakes. 24 earthquakes, 24 droughts, 17 epidemics, 12 floods, 12 hurricanes, tsunamis, that kind of stuff, only 2 volcanoes and 1 landslide. 58% in Asia, and only 18 in Europe, 7 in the Americas, North and South, and 23 in Africa. So it's mostly Asia, almost 60% of the natural disasters, the floods, hurricanes, droughts, famines. You can see, the question is, if there is a loving, good, powerful God who knows all things, why create a world that's so mean and nasty? I'd like to say, I've seen people try and say, well, for instance, hurricanes serve a biological function. They stir up the waters, the chemicals hit the land, and the land becomes richer, and the waters become purified. You can argue those things. But you can also argue that it's not a good thing to live on a volcano, and it's not a good thing for those of us who are so rich to let people suffer. I mean, most of these disasters happen where people are poor and their housing is inadequate. And of course, a little rumble of the earth and it's gone, whereas we could withstand all kinds of torment here and still survive. So a lot of it's our fault, but it's still a very difficult issue. And theologians really struggle with this one. Part of that physical evil, a subdivision of that which we didn't even talk about until about 20 or 30 years ago, is the issue of animal suffering, animal pain. If you ever turn on the news these days, just prepare yourself for a most disgusting sight. Like the turkeys in Turkey are being literally, picked up and shoved into bags. Maybe if you're from a farm and it's just nothing to go and kill a duck or a turkey and chase it around the farmyard with an axe, but some of us are not used to this. It is cruel beyond belief. And you know the stories. The chickens are all clipped with their beaks, crammed into little cages and their little egg layers before Kentucky Fried gets them. And the bulls never see a cow and all of it. Christianity has not addressed that issue until the last 20, 30 years. And now we have journal after journal talking about animal suffering. Thank God, because we are causing a lot of physical pain. To say that they don't feel anything. You just have to have a dog or a cat. Sure, they feel. Obviously, they feel something. We took in a third cat one time, and cat number 1 decided that he wasn't going to eat anymore. And $1,000 later, and a stomach tube that we fed with a needle because he went from 18 pounds to 8. He feels. I was too busy with the little one outside. The other one just eats. He's a compulsive eater just to show that I need more attention, I'm sure, because they feel. We're going to be able to say things like, there are some really good reasons why some, and maybe most suffering is allowed by God. But there's one thing that's really, really difficult to understand. This one's called the evidential problem of evil. That's where the action is these days. The logical problem of evil has been solved, and I'll show you how. The evidential problem has become the big problem. Some evil, quite frankly, maybe all evil, but I wouldn't want to push that, but let's say an awful lot of evil can lead to a greater good. If you're suffering some horrible disease, or you go through some horrible trauma, some horrible state, and you come out stronger for it, it's not God that gave it to you, but you've used that suffering that probably comes from other people and from the world, you've used it for a good. Now, wouldn't life be nice if we could say that all misery and suffering leads to some greater good. Some people say that, but the atheists now have a different argument. We have to answer this one, and it's not easy. And there's 3 or 4 different answers, but I'll just show you the problem. The evidential problem says some evil may be necessary for a greater good. Some evil may lead to a greater good, so maybe God was justified in allowing it. But there is such a thing as meaningless, pointless evil that has no greater good. It's called the problem of gratuitous evil. Meaningless, gratuitous. Gratuitous simply means it's pointless, it's meaningless. And there are 2 major examples, and this is what reminded me of this. I was talking about animal suffering. One major atheist, this very same atheist is the one who said, I no longer will argue about the logical problem. I agree it's not a logical contradiction. We're going to read him. His name is William Rowe, R-O-W-E, just in case you're curious. We'll get to him. We can't do it all this week. He gives 2 examples of evil that he claims is completely useless. And therefore, he says, isn't that good evidence against belief in God? So the evidential problem is not saying belief in God is like a logical contradiction, saying that you can't believe God's all-powerful, God's all-loving, and evil exists. You can't believe all 3. You have to get rid of one, and you can't get rid of one. So now the evidential problem is saying there's good evidence that some evil has no justification at all. And he gives 2 examples. A small child being raped and murdered. What possible good is there in that? But then he hits you with a second one in another book, and he says, this deer has been caught in a forest that's hit by lightning, and of course the forest burns down, and the fawn catches on fire and dies a slow, lingering death. You could say, there's absolutely no value in that. God, he says, if God existed, would take that suffering away, who would know the difference? But he says, it's not just one fawn. It's millions of fawns, millions of animals, millions of creatures, non-human creatures, suffering. And he thinks that's good evidence. It's not logically conclusive. It's not a logical argument, but it's an evidential. It's a personal, based on my personal experience. That's where the atheists are now. They're saying, you believe in God, but my personal experience is that there's so much evidence of meaningless suffering, meaningless stuff. We have to answer that one. There are 2 answers. There's no such thing as meaningless suffering. It all has some value, seen from some perspective. And if there is meaningless suffering, there's no rule of the universe that says that there has to be a reason for everything. It's a very difficult problem, to say the least. All of this is going to come in chapter 3 when we get to the section in Encountering Evil by Davis. Is belief in God a logical contradiction? And that's a logical problem. We could say, I'll show you, it isn't. It can be solved. All we need, by the way, if you want to know how it's solved, if you can't wait, if you have 3 propositions that seem to be a logical contradiction, God's all-loving, God's all-powerful, yet evil exists, you have to show there's a logical contradiction by using a 4th proposition. And the atheists have never been able to produce a 4th proposition to show that the first 3 are logical contradictions. But the theists have a 4th proposition to show there is no logical contradiction. More on that later. I'm going to show you the philosophical, rational responses to this thing, and then we're going to look at theological responses. And as much as we can, we'll throw in some other religion if we can do that so you can get a whole perspective here. But believe me, the Christian perspective is complicated enough, let alone trying to figure out what other religions beyond those believe. You'll see in the book by Boyd that there is a spiritual warfare solution that the early Christians and Jesus took seriously. The Catholic Church is the world's largest religion, 1.1 billion people. They believe in Satan. Christians are supposed to believe in Satan, a creature with free will that doesn't cause all the evil, but agitates us. 2.1 billion Christians, 1.3 billion Muslims, and they officially believe in Satan. I actually used a book 2 years ago called Satan and the Problem of Evil. Year before that, I used a book here called God at War, which was showing just all the warfare going on with It's not the solution completely, but it certainly is an ingredient in the mixture that if you omit it, then you're just philosophically rational without getting into what the religions actually say. I do want to make a distinction just for you to bear in mind. This is academia. It's not a temple or a mosque or a church, but it shouldn't be different in those places, but it is. Most people don't do what we're doing in this class, right? This is why we're here. A theological, academic, rational, intellectual approach to an issue. Most people don't do this. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the means to do it. It's very difficult to do this. What most people do is simply live their lives trying to cope with suffering, rather than explain it or understand it. So there is a distinction between coping and understanding. I can quote Rabbi Kushner, but Rabbi Kushner, when bad things happen to good people, 8 million copies 30 years ago, and he says suffering people don't want explanation. What they want is consolation. They want you to suffer with them, support them, to console them. Yes, okay, I agree. My thesis is, though, how are you coping? How are you possibly coping without an explanation? So you're standing there saying, I'm suffering, I've just lost my child, or I've just got cancer, and I'm going to cope with this. How do you cope? Because your friends are going to say, well, it was God's will. It was all, you remember the stuff we read last time, all these little, I mean, they're not little, they're just what people try to do to cope. We cope with explanations whether we know it or like it or not. So my point would be, I think you can cope with suffering when it hits an awful lot better if you've been through the explanations first. You all have your own explanations already, right? You have them. If you suffer, you're either saying, if you believe in God, you're saying God is testing me, or there's a reason for this. It simply acknowledges that there's a God, so there must be a reason. That's fine. A lot of people, the majority, leave it right there. I believe in a God, there must be a reason. Why should I think I could possibly know it? Well, I could say that other people are going to tell you there isn't a reason. Worse, other people are going to give you horrible reasons. Walk into a hospital room and say, you've been punished. What did you do? What sinful act did you think of or do? What a horrible thing to say. So somebody's suffering, and you walk in and make it even worse by making them now feel guilty because they're being punished. That's what we do. So people who think they're just coping are being bombarded with explanations. And those ones I read in the paper, that God took my son because he was too good for this world, that's a tragedy, but God did not take her son. A drunken driver did. We don't want to be blaming God for these horrible things and then wondering whether this God is really good or really powerful, and then all of a sudden your belief in God is almost meaningless, because if God doesn't prevent suffering and you think it's all from God, it doesn't seem fair. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to cope with the suffering that you and I are going to endure, not just by being with each other once a week, but in general. We're going to cope with this suffering by trying to eliminate bad explanations. Blaming God is at the top of the list as a very bad explanation. If you say God is testing me, this is why I lost my child, or God is giving me a way to make my faith grow deeper. Do you know all those explanations that we have in scriptures, like it's a test of faith, it's a way to become more spiritually mature, it's punishment, it's discipline. All of those things might actually have some value if the person didn't say, God gave me this as punishment. God gave me this as a test. I would say you gave it to me, and I gave it to you. We give it to each other. What God does is give us the ability to deal with it and use it as a test, or use it to deepen our faith. Part of that hidden Holocaust thing was to list how many people have cancer, and basically it says somewhere that most of it is human caused, right? We caused that too. Why blame God? You know what happens when something goes wrong in this world? We make it too simplistic. We say on the one hand, if somebody has cancer or somebody's suffering, it's either their fault or it's God's fault. Quite frankly, what it is, if we really knew all the causes, you're living in Windsor, you're drinking the water, too many Harvey burgers, the air is bad, and it's more complicated than that. Your genetics your history. There's a billion reasons for why you are where you are now, genetically, let alone anything else. Other people's decisions, the world's natural laws, all of these things have caused your particular suffering right at this second. Instead of saying that there are all these reasons, God's going to give us the strength to get through it, what we do is we blame God. Or we blame ourselves and say, well, I'm just being punished, or I'm being tested. I don't mind you thinking you're being tested, thinking you're being punished, as long as you don't blame God for it. We have this reductionism. Let's blame God for everything or blame us for everything, when I think, in fact, it's very complicated why anything happens. We don't know. We don't know all the causes. The real question might be, too, why didn't God intervene and prevent that? You know the simple answer, right? If God intervened to protect one case of enlarged heart death, why not them all? That's called the slippery slope argument. Where would it stop? If God, quite frankly, took away all known diseases, my guess is we would be complaining about what's left as the new diseases, like hangnails, and not being in a state of ecstasy all the time. There'd always be something that isn't perfect. It's a simple fact. There's no simple answer. All I'm saying is no one knows the reason why that happens. You could go through the history, the genetics, and all of these things, and you still wouldn't find it. You might find some clues, but we just don't know all the causes. But I just am cautioning, don't blame God or don't blame the person, because the real suffering comes with the guilt, thinking God's done it because you deserved it. That's nasty. You've got enough to cope with without that kind of guilt. That's my gripe with reincarnation sometimes, too, with this karma theory that it's almost the same thing. The Buddhist, the Hindu, whatever, in general terms. Those people who believe in reincarnation would say, you're suffering now because you're being punished by this impersonal law of the universe called karma. Every thought, every action, every deed that you caused in all your millions of former lifetimes is determining the life you have now. So there is this theory in Eastern religions that we are literally living what we deserve in this life. I've even seen Hindu scholars make cases applying that to Western psychology. People who are clumsy and stumble around, they were making a case that that's just all karma from reincarnation. And, if this were a Hinduism class, we could go into some depth and go through all that stuff. But what I'm saying is this punishment theory is not just in the mind of a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, thinking that they're suffering because God is punishing them. I'm going to show you the reactions of the Jews to the Holocaust when 6 million were slaughtered. I've got a chapter 9 in that God and Evil book. Some of them say it's God's punishment. Some of them say God is making the Jews suffer for the good of the whole world. They have all these different reasons, but it's ingrained in the human mind that if there's a God, this place should be perfect. If it isn't perfect, then somehow we've messed it up and God has to punish us, and that we're just paying the price. I'm not saying go ahead and do anything you want, God doesn't punish, but there is a judgment day for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and we take that seriously. But I don't think diseases and all of this is a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim belief. That shouldn't be anyway, that it's all God's punishment. Now, if it says in the Bible that God took out this city because this city was sinful and that was punishment, that's a case where God can punish if God wants. But my caution is we have maybe 15 or 20 theories in scriptures alone, let alone in theology. We can't apply one of those theories and say because God punished Sodom and Gomorrah, therefore all evil, all suffering must be God's punishment. That's a fundamental logical mistake. Just because this one case was God's punishment, this one case of suffering, you can't say that all suffering is God's punishment. You can't say it's all a test of faith. You can't say all suffering leads to spiritual growth. Some of it does. We have to distinguish which it is. A lot of suffering does lead to spiritual growth. I mean, if we never suffered, we'd still be babies, all of us. It does lead to growth. If you've suffered and you're still standing, you're bent but not broken, to quote Gordon Lightfoot, you're still here. That's a good sign.
Please join Dr. Whitney for further episodes in this God and Evil podcast series. And for more information and resources about reconciling belief in God with the problem of evil and suffering, visit Dr. Whitney's website at drbarrywhitney.com.